Welcome back, everyone. We are continuing our broadcasts 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, on the coronavirus, the CCP virus. And again, I'm broadcasting here in my apartment in New York. And so first off, before we get into it, the investigative documentary I told you all I was working on is now out. If you haven't seen it yet, check it out in our videos. We have it published here. It's also on some of the other Epoch Times video websites. And with that said, the documentary looks into the origins of the Wuhan coronavirus, this CCP virus. We look into the laboratories, we look into the research the Chinese regime was doing. We detail the history of the research, the individuals involved, and a lot of news stories, that things that happened in China that were not widely reported outside of China. I think you'll all find it very interesting. A lot of work went into it. With that said, let's get into it now. So first off, a Chinese journalist got into a, minor spat with President Trump during one of these White House press briefings on the virus. And it is raising questions now over how a journalist, she was with Phoenix TV, with ties to the Chinese Communist Party, is able to get into the White House press briefings at a time when the Chinese regime is using media to push these various narratives under its information war around the CCP virus.
So I'll let you know. I mean, I hope they're going to honor the deal. We'll find out.
With China, are you cooperating with China?
I don't know. Who are you working for? China? You work for China, or are you with a newspaper? Who are you with?
Hong Kong Phoenix TV.
Who owns that? China? Is it owned by China?
Hong Kong.
No, is it owned by the state?
No, it's not. It's a private-owned company.
Okay, good. Okay.
And so, of course, this journalist, she denies that she is with a media controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, but Phoenix TV is a bit more complicated than that. It's currently being exposed in a lot of ways, and it has been exposed before as well. Daily Caller had a great article on it. They note that the Hoover Institute previously reported that Phoenix TV is only a semi-official news outlet, and it's tied to the CCP's, the Chinese Communist Party's, Ministry of State Security. The MSS is kind of like a cross between the FBI and the CIA for the Chinese regime. It also notes that Freedom House reported that Phoenix TV is owned by a former PLA officer with ties to Beijing officials, PLA, People's Liberation Army, official military of the Chinese Communist Party. And Ted Cruz, Senator Ted Cruz, actually wrote an open letter questioning why Phoenix TV has been allowed into these White House press briefings. So it's important to note that the journalists, the media that are chosen to be at a lot of these press briefings when it comes to the White House, are not necessarily selected by the White House. They're selected by the White House Correspondents Association, this press pool. You all were asking, is Epoch Times at these? Why are we not at these? The Epoch Times is accredited for the White House. We actually do have White House reporters, but we were not able to get into these virus, and these daily virus briefings because the press pool, of course, the number of journalists there is limited. Press pool did not allow us in. But Ted Cruz is recapping now what happened. He's questioning how this Phoenix TV journalist managed to get in. He said, quote, "So to recap, the White House Correspondents Association gave a seat at the White House briefing to an employee of the Chinese Communist government to ask globally televised questions to POTUS, President of the United States. At the same time, China is waging a propaganda campaign to hide their culpability and cover-up of the Wuhan virus." Now, moving on to some of what's happening in China right now. I mentioned previously the Chinese regime was announcing it was going to open up Wuhan on April 8th, Wuhan being the epicenter of the virus. And also the Chinese regime was for a long time saying there's no new cases, no new cases. And as I told you all before, that's not the case in China. There are ongoing cases. It has not gone away. The CCP was sending people home who had the virus. And as I mentioned, they were going to announce a second wave. Well, that second wave is on us, and the Chinese regime is already starting to back off the reopening of Wuhan. They did a partial reopening. So while they were supposed to end the lockdown on April 8th, there are still many restrictions. including on transportation, and there are even tighter controls on some residential compounds. Now, there's also a possible human rights risk taking place in China right now because while they're reopening, they're also emptying out the hospitals. People who are sick, not just with the virus, but with other things, are being told to go home. And this is part of, it appears at least, the Chinese regime's program to, say, wipe off the dust from its face, to powder its own face. Central News Agency in Taiwan reported, quote, "The Wuhan traffic police also reminded the public, quote, removal of the control of leaving the Han Channel does not mean that the prevention and control measures are lifted, nor does it mean that the epidemic alert is lifted. People who do not need to leave the Han and do not need to resume work and try their best to avoid going out." In other words, the police are saying, yes, it's opened, but it's not really open, and so don't go out unless you absolutely have to. It sounds a whole lot like the same systems of pseudo-quarantine we have in a lot of places here in the US right now, only of course slightly different. RFA is noting that there are ongoing virus infections as well, and the Chinese Communist Party has some of these communities on lockdown still. It reported, quote, "At present, the epidemic in Wuhan is extremely complex and changeable, and many people are worried about being infected. But for residents who have been suspended for more than 2 months, if they do not have economic income, they will also die." As we reported before, the virus never ended in China. Again, this is what happened. If you remember, this was, the biggest issue in China. All the cities were on lockdown. The Chinese regime was talking about it nonstop, going down city streets, spraying chemicals everywhere to try to get rid of the virus. Announcing daily all the measures it was taking, and then suddenly, the next day, overnight, it was over. Chinese regime declared it was over. So what actually happened? Xi Jinping, the head of the Chinese Communist Party, came out and said that people need to go back to work. And that was based on an assessment that close to a third of Chinese businesses were about to go out of business. And within maybe a few weeks of that, or a couple months, another third were going to go out of business. The Chinese regime was facing economic collapse. And so Xi Jinping came out and said, people need to go back to work. Things need to reopen. And so what happens? All the Chinese state media come out and say the virus is over, no new cases, go back to work. Meanwhile, there's an online video going around that shows doctors in Wuhan in full medical garb looking like they're moving bodies in the dead of night. And Chinese netizens are commenting on this, that this is how the Chinese Communist Party is covering it up. They're kind of dark humor. They're joking that the CCP needs to keep the official numbers low. This is how they're doing it. Also, train tickets from Shanghai to Wuhan are allegedly sold out. And this very likely people returning back to work, returning home. Maybe of course 5 million people left Wuhan before before the lockdown went in place. Who knows why they're going back, but this has people in Shanghai very concerned about this because Wuhan has a stigma around it still. Actually, Hubei province in general has a strong stigma around it still in China. And meanwhile, 4 different regions in Guangdong province in China have raised their alert levels. And there are rumors that the Chinese regime is closing villages. The Chinese regime is denying those rumors. And also there are blockades being put in place while the Chinese regime says things are under control. In one area, get this, all right? Now, all entrances in one area have been sealed off, and Chinese authorities, the Chinese Communist Party's authorities, are saying it's not under lockdown, it's just surrounded and sealed. Right? Now, meanwhile, international criticism of the Chinese Communist Party is growing for its cover-up, one, that allowed the virus to spread internationally and left many countries unprepared for it, and 2, because the Chinese regime has a, stranglehold on the international supply of face masks and medical goods. The Chinese Communist Party bought up most of them, and also forbade companies, even American companies operating in China, from exporting them out of China. Conor McGregor, former UFC champion, is calling out the Chinese Communist Party for selling unusable medical equipment to Ireland. And you may have seen in our last report, we talked about how Iran is even calling out the Chinese Communist Party now for hiding the numbers and for leaving it unprepared for the severity of the virus. And now Brazil is joining in as well. The Brazilian Minister of Education, Abraham Weintraub, tweeted online, of course on Twitter, questioning who will come out stronger from this global crisis, and question who in Brazil is allied with this an infallible plan for world domination, referring to the Chinese Communist Party. He's being called out now for being racist for his tweet because allegedly he put letters into his writing. He, of course, wrote it in Portuguese that make it sound like it's written in a Chinese accent. And the Chinese ambassador, Yang Wanming, accused him of racism. Many Western news outlets repeated this accusation from the Chinese ambassador. But the Brazilian Minister of Education is not giving up. He actually followed it up. He deleted his initial tweet, actually. But he did follow up with an interview on Brazilian radio. And he's accusing the Chinese Communist Party of using its medical equipment makers to profit from the pandemic. And on that, too, Peter Navarro, assistant to Trump and director of trade and manufacturing policy, well, he's been pretty strong on China from the get-go. Of course, he wrote Death by China, which was also made into a documentary. But he's also calling out the Chinese regime for what it's doing with this mask diplomacy. He's noting now that within a month, the CCP had imported 2.2 billion masks from around the world, which is about half of the annual supply, allegedly. And the Chinese Communist Party is, of course, hoarding these and using them for this mask diplomacy, as we mentioned. We noted before that in France, the Chinese Communist Party is saying it will only supply masks if France agrees to use Huawei 5G. So the Chinese regime is using this as leverage for other interests. Many companies in China that have no capability to produce masks have been doing so as well for profit. And they are receiving a lot of scrutiny internationally because a lot of these products exported outside of China are found to be non-functional or incapable of defending against viruses. The Chinese regime right now is putting on this whole show of investigations into these companies. Now, in other news, the Chinese ministry spokesperson, Zhao Lijian, you might remember him on Twitter for making all this noise, claiming that, or spreading this conspiracy theory, saying that the United States military brought the virus to China when they had their war games in Wuhan back in October. He was tweeting still, but he disappeared from the public eye after that tweet, and he only recently reappeared. He was at a press conference of the CCP's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and a Japanese reporter asks him about the source of the virus and about his tweet. And what does he respond? He says now that his tweet was his own opinion. Of course, as we mentioned, the Chinese Communist Party was pushing this narrative. They spread this narrative everywhere, claiming the virus started in Wuhan but did not necessarily originate in Wuhan. Started in China but did not necessarily originate in China. Then they started spreading conspiracy theories that the United States was hiding its numbers, that the United States was the real source of the virus, and that the U.S. military had brought it there during these war games. Zhao Lijian was one of the main voices on that. There were other voices, such as with Global Times, one of the foreign missions of the Chinese Communist Party, masquerading as a news outlet, official foreign mission under the State Department, registered, also saying the same thing. Now he's saying it was his own opinion. And why does he say it's his own opinion? As we reported here, Trump and Xi allegedly made an agreement. Xi said he would back off of this propaganda push against the United States, claiming it was a source of the virus. And what is the new narrative of the CCP? The new narrative is pushing for U.S.-China cooperation. And so what does Zhao Lijian say next? Now he's calling for U.S.-China cooperation. Go figure. Now, Vice News actually had a great article pointing to the Chinese regime's propaganda push of trying to convince the Chinese people that the virus came from the United States. They had an article, quote, "The Chinese government has convinced its citizens that the U.S. Army brought coronavirus to Wuhan." And of course, again, this narrative that the Chinese regime was spreading was not limited to this one spokesperson. It was a narrative being pushed by many different voices, many different organizations that the Chinese Communist Party runs to spread its propaganda within China and outside of China. Vice pointed out that in China, many now believe this narrative. They interviewed a 45-year-old Chinese American who recently returned to China to take care of her parents, and she said, quote, "Sadly, most Chinese people really believe the U.S. brought the virus to China, and they call it the USA virus. The CCP's anti-American propaganda is very successful." And also, we reported on some of the panic in China, the panic buying, and rumors of a coming famine. The Chinese regime is fighting back against those rumors. As we mentioned before, back in 2014, the Chinese Communist Party relinquished its policy for grain self-sufficiency. The black soil regions in China, which are its main areas for growing crops, were receding. It was ending. You had deserts moving into the big cities. A lot of the soil in China was failing. What does the Chinese Communist Party do? They end their policy for grain self-sufficiency. They switched to pork. They had the swine flu that wiped out a lot of that. They also switched to poultry. They had the avian flu that wiped out a lot of that as well. There is concerns that China does not have enough food to feed its people because it's been relying for a long time on foreign exports. These foreign exports now are being cut off, not completely, but to a larger extent, because countries are trying to keep their own resources for their own people. And so the Chinese regime is trying to quell these rumors that there's this coming crisis. There were two different alleged government documents that were leaked, and Chinese people were spreading it on kind of a grassroots level that was warning Communist Party members that they need to start stockpiling months' worth of food. Who knows if those documents were real, but Chinese people have been stockpiling food because of this. And now China's, quote, father of hybrid rice, Yuan Longping, is coming out on Chinese state media and changing his narrative from before. Now, last year, he said in an interview with CCTV, one of the main Chinese state-run media, that China was facing a food crisis, that there was a risk of a lack of food in China. Now they went and interviewed him, and he's saying the opposite, that China faces no risk of a food crisis. Regarding the food security problems that may be brought about by the current outbreak of new pneumonia, Yuan Longping said that China is fully capable of achieving self-sufficiency in food production, and there will be no, quote, food shortage. I hope you do not worry. And of course, those of you who know what he said last year, this is an interesting break from what he was saying. Last year in the interview with CCTV, this is what he said. When a reporter asked him about China's grain, saying that China has enough grain, he replied, quote, no, China has a population of about 1.4 billion. China's grain is not enough to eat. It needs to be imported, and part of it must be imported. Let me give you an example. Soybeans are not enough to eat. We Chinese eat tofu and import 7 to 80 million tons of soybeans every year. So it's interesting now that this individual who was warning of a food crisis in China, noting that China does not have enough food to feed its own people without imports, is now changing his narrative on Chinese media. Basic analysis, it looks like the Chinese regime is using a well-known face, someone that warned them about possibly, the need of making more domestic growth when it comes to, say, rice and things like this. Someone they trust coming out and quelling these fears that the Chinese Communist Party is trying to quell, that they're going to face a food crisis. And now for some virus news from outside of China. Now, the chair of the New York City Council Health Committee wrote on Twitter that they may start using New York City parks for mass graves. Meanwhile, Kaiser Health News is reporting that this virus has a mysterious effect to it, where it doesn't only impact the lungs. There have been some reports saying that the effect on the lungs is almost like getting the bends. It's a very bizarre effect it has on the lungs. But Kaiser is now reporting it's not just the lungs, but it also appears to damage the heart. India is also now releasing supplies of hydrochlorine after Trump put pressure on them. Now, Trump has, of course, been talking about this malaria drug that can possibly work as something to help treat the virus. And, of course, there's been back and forth over this. We won't say what's accurate or what's not because, honestly, I can't confirm it. But regardless, Trump said on Monday during a press briefing, quote, I spoke to him, being Modi, Sunday morning, called him and I said, we'd appreciate you allowing our supply to come out, supply of this medication. If he doesn't allow it to come out, that would be okay. But of course, there may be retaliation. Why wouldn't there be? Afterwards, India did release these medications. And so the US may be able to get more of them now. And also, the UK, the United Kingdom, has millions of virus test kits, but they don't work. Why don't they work? Well, they bought them from China. Same problem we've seen in other places. Same problem we've seen in Spain. Same problem we've seen in Czech Republic. Reports that 80% or 70%, somewhere in that range, don't work. Now, the Times in the UK paraphrased a Professor John Newton, who's Director of Public Health Improvement for Public Health England, saying that tests ordered from China were able to identify immunity accurately only in people who had been severely ill, and that Britain was no longer hoping to buy millions of kits off the shelves. That is not a direct quote, that's a paraphrase from the Times. Also, US companies are now starting to manufacture these medical equipment by themselves. Now, of course, the pillow guy, Mike Lindell, MyPillow, he announced that he's going to start manufacturing face masks. Now you have Xerox making a partnership with Vorton to mass produce disposable ventilators, and Ford Motor Company announced that it delivered over 1 million face shields in 2 weeks. Face shields are those whole face ones. And also some news from around the world. A lot of different, say, heavy-handed responses in some different countries. Japan is finally declaring a state of emergency. They were holding off on this for a good while. And they're preparing close to a $1 trillion stimulus. Thailand approved an $82.5 billion plan, also working as kind of a stimulus to lower the impact of the virus. Finland is going to begin doing random virus tests in hospitals. Switzerland deployed close to 5,000 army soldiers to help with civilian medical staff, and around 8,000 soldiers to secure its borders and help with security. And of course, you may all remember that Sweden was being touted as one of the models of dealing with this virus, where they didn't really close things down, people were still moving, while Sweden is now backing off that as well. Now, Sweden is warning its citizens to prepare for thousands of deaths. And they're also preparing a new bill to expand government powers and possibly close down transit hubs and hospitals. And also the Navajo Nation, of course Native Americans, had a report. They're now saying that they're one of the worst hit in the world, if you go by individuals per thousand impacted. And they're taking different measures to deal with this growing problem, including closing schools. And last but not least, something y'all might be interested in hearing, Trump said in a Tuesday press conference that the United States will place a hold on funding to the World Health Organization, the WHO.
WHO, that's the World Health Organization, receives vast amounts of money from the United States. They criticized and disagreed with my travel ban at the time I did it. And they were wrong. They've been wrong about a lot of things. And they had a lot of information early, and they didn't want to, they seemed to be very China-centric.
Now he's saying the WHO was wrong on the virus, maybe even knew how deadly it was, and that it's too China-centric. Trump said, quote, they seem to be very China-centric. We're going to look into it. He said also they called it wrong. They could have called it months earlier. They should have known. They probably did know. We're going to put a hold on money spent on WHO. Trump saying that the WHO may have known about this, may have known the real severity. And we'll see what happens if the US investigates it, like Trump is suggesting they'll do. He also notes that referring to the travel restrictions with China, of course, the Trump administration put travel restrictions on China pretty early on. It received a lot of criticism about that, including from the WHO. Trump said, quote, "Interestingly, the WHO wasn't in favor of us closing it down." And he also said, quote, referring to the WHO, "They seem to err always on the side of China, and we fund it." And of course, that funding is now being put on hold, according to Trump. Now, with that said, folks, please remember to like and subscribe. We really need your support. Really, we're independent and really appreciate, the way this channel's grown. I really appreciate your support. Also, the investigative documentary, again, as I mentioned, is out now. Check it out. A lot of work went into it. We investigated the origin of this coronavirus. We looked into the Chinese labs. We looked into the history of their research. We looked into some of the different leaks that came out of that lab. We look into their documents. We look into whistleblowers who came out of there. And we also look into the Chinese Communist Party's programs for biological warfare, unconventional warfare, and a lot of different things that were not widely reported. I think you'll all find it very interesting. Of course, with that said, as always, if you have questions or comments for me, leave them in the comments section. I do read the comments, and every Monday I'll be going over some of those on the show. And of course, I really appreciate your support. You folks are great. I really enjoy reading your comments as well. Now, again, we're broadcasting Monday through Friday. Tune in. See you next time.